Welcome back, everybody. We're going to continue our note-taking on worms. We're going to talk about three types of worms: flatworms, three major groups of flatworms, roundworms, annelid worms, three types of annelid worms, and closed versus open circulatory systems. After we're done with worms, we're going to move on and talk about mollusks. All right, so let's talk about worms. There are three types of worms: flatworms, roundworms, annelid, otherwise called segmented worms. Probably the most familiar you're familiar with is annelid or segmented worms. Those are earthworms. But there's some other ones. The first one we're going to talk about is flatworms. Flatworms, they're kind of funky looking. They got like these two eye spots. They're called planaria, is this example. They have bilateral symmetry, which means you can fold them upon themselves on one plane, going right down between the eyes. They have a defined head, and they have, most of them have some sort of eye spots. But these are planaria, flukes, and tapeworms. So these three major groups of flatworms, planarias and marine flatworms, are freshwater and damp land environments. Predators. They are sensory lobes to find food, and they have eye spots. Well, mostly to see like light and dark. Then you have flukes. Flukes are a parasite. They have tiny heads without eye spots or sensory lobes. They have sometimes suckers or hooks to attach to a host. Then you have tapeworms. Tapeworms have a small head, no eye spots, parasites, and there's no gut. And they attach to the intestines of the animal. Then we talk about roundworms. Roundworms. They have long, slim, round bodies. Think like spaghetti shaped. They are bilateral symmetry also, so they can fold upon themselves. Simple nervous system. That means they have a brain too. They're very small. If you think about like one rotten apple, maybe you buy it at the store, which you shouldn't, but that could almost have 100,000 roundworms. I think about when I go apple picking and I see the rotten apple on the ground. I'm like, ooh, well, so many roundworms could be breaking that down as a parasite, because that's what it wants to do. Breaks down tissue of plants and animals, and it actually is helpful for the soil. And some are parasites like pinworm or hookworm. Sometimes your dog or your cat could get these types of worms. Then you have annelid worms. Annelid worms are segmented. That means every ring is identical. They have repeating body parts. They have bilateral symmetry. They have a closed circulatory system, which we're going to talk about in a few minutes. Complex nervous system with a brain. They have a nerve cord that connects the brain to the ganglion in each segment. They eat animals and plants, and they live in water and on land. So the different types of earthworms, there are three of them. The most common annelid worm that you know of is an earthworm, about 100, 175 segments. Next week, we're going to dissect these. So then what their job is to eat soil, or breaks down plant, animal matter, and leave castings. Castings is their waste product. So the castings are going to make the soil even much more healthier. Worms also dig tunnels that allow water to reach deep into the soil. They have like these little bristles, stiff hairs on their body that row through the soil. Then you have marine worms. So you see this says palachetes. Palachetes means many bristles. Come in many colors. So these are actually going to be very vibrant in colors. Eat mollusks or small animals. They'll filter food from the water. And there's leeches. You go swimming in a pond or kind of a lake that has a lot of a muddy bottom, or has a lot of leaves on the bottom. You might be familiar with leeches. They want to suck blood from animals. Others are scavengers or predators, eating snails, insects, and slugs. Blood-sucking leeches can be used in medicine to prevent clotting or help reattach even severed appendages. So that brings us to closed and open circulatory system. You saw that when we talked about worms today, that they all have a closed circulatory system. That means that there's veins, arteries, and capillaries that carry blood. The blood flows through the entire organism. and has a true heart. Meanwhile, there's other animals that have an open circulatory system. The open circulatory system means openings to organs in the body. There's no blood vessels, there's no arteries and veins or capillaries. There's not a lot of blood throughout the entire animal, so the kind of blood just gets kind of moved around, it gets bathed in blood, splashed with blood. And there's no real true heart that actually can cause the pumping to happen. We'll talk more about that when we talk about arthropods and even our mollusks. All right, so that brings us to the worm anatomy. So when we do our dissections, this is what you're going to kind of create here. You're going to create an opening of your worm, and you're going to try to identify these main parts. And your teachers are going to cover this more. And you're going to see the intestine, you're going to see a gizzard, you're going to see seminal vesicles, you're going to see hearts, you're going to see a pharynx, esophagus, a crop, gizzard, dorsal blood vessels. And this place right here is where some of the reproductive organs are going to go, called the clitellum. If you have time, you'll be able to have a chance to take a cross-section of your worm. And if you put it underneath a microscope, this is kind of what it looks like from the end view, called the cross-section. You see muscle tissue. You see there is a gut and a coelom, and that's the space between the muscle and the gut. It's called the coelom. All right, that brings us to mollusks. In mollusks, we're talking about mollusk anatomy, mollusk classes. Those classes fall under polyplacophora, gastropods, bivalves, and cephalopods. So let's talk about all mollusks have 4 main structures. They all have a foot that helps the animal move and also makes a mucus, a mantle, which protects the inside of the body, a visceral mass, which has gills and gut and other organs, and then radula. It's a rough tongue to clean the rock that it's working its way around. Mollusks are kind of a group of misfits. If they don't fit in the other categories of invertebrates, they kind of go into this mollusk category. You have polyplacophora, which example would be chitin. You might not know what a chitin is, but it's a kind of a creature that has a lot of different shells over the top. Then you have gastropods, snails, bivalves, clams, cephalopods, squid, could also be octopus. So this polyplacophora. So this is what I was talking about. That has these little plates and little shell on top pieces. The polyplacophora are all marine saltwater creatures. Their shell is divided into 8 plates. They live on rocks along the seashore, and they're going to feed on algae on rocks. Then you have gastropods. Gastro means stomach. Pod means foot. So they're stomach foot. You have snails, you have slugs, and then something called the nudibranch. Then you have bivalves. It's a 2-part hinge shell made by the mantle. There's no head. You have clams, oysters, scallops. Those fall in this category of bivalves. Then our last group is cephalopods. Cephalopods are all marine saltwater. They have a cephalo, means head. So pod means foot, so means head-footed. Octopus would be an example, having 8 tentacles, squid having 10 tentacles, cuttlefish, and nautilus would be our examples of these. And that will bring us to the end of our mollusk notes.